So I want you to imagine a really stark visual, just a completely blank, minimalist white canvas in your mind.
Okay, so setting the scene.
Right. And on the left side of this canvas, picture a bright, sunny little icon representing Jamaica. You know, the beautiful natural landscapes, the vibrant
A
culture.
very welcoming image.
Exactly. But then on the right side of the canvas, picture this cold, harsh, incredibly steep curve, like a data line just shooting straight up into the corner. And that line represents wealth distribution.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is quite the contrast.
It is, and it's the core of what we're unpacking in today's deep dive, because there is this massive paradox happening, and we really need to look at it. You see a country that, on paper, is incredibly generous. Like, the government in Jamaica spends a huge percentage of its budget on education and Social Security.
Right, the Social Security expenditure weight reached roughly 0.25 in 2023, which is, I mean, that's massive.
It is, it's a quarter of the weight. But here's the paradox. Despite all that spending, despite all that quote-unquote generosity, the wealth gap hasn't shrunk.
Not at all.
So the big question I want you, the listener, to keep in mind today is this. Why does a country so focused on social welfare still have its top 1% hoarding just an astonishing share of the wealth?
It's the million-dollar question. Or, well, trillion-dollar question, as we'll see in the data.
Right. Because the net domestic product, the NDP, has grown nearly sixfold over the last 70 years, but has the standard of living for the average person actually improved? Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it. And I think it's important to set a calm, analytical tone right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Because to understand the what here, we really have to dig into the why.
Definitely.
And before we get into the numbers, we need to put a very crucial disclaimer out there.
Yes, please do. This is so important.
Topics like wealth inequality, taxation, government spending, they are highly politically charged.
Yeah.
Across both the left-wing and right-wing spectrums globally.
Oh, absolutely. People get very heated about this stuff.
Exactly. So, for the record, we're not taking any political sides today. We're not endorsing any viewpoints, left, right, or center. Our job today is strictly and impartially to report the data contained in this specific macroeconomic source material.
And we're just looking at the mechanics.
Right. We just want to understand the structural realities at play in these ledgers. So, to understand why the pie isn't being shared equally, we first have to look at how much the pie has actually grown.
Yeah, let's get into the macro picture. Because the 70-year climb up this NDP mountain is wild.
It really is. If you look at the line graph tracking the average net domestic product, the NDP, for the entire population, it starts back in 1950.
And just for context, NDP is basically GDP, but it accounts for depreciation, right? It's like the actual net wealth.
Exactly. It's a very solid measure of true value creation. So in 1950, that average NDP was sitting at 32,044.7.
Okay.
Now, fast forward through the decades to 2024. That figure reaches 1,015,524.9.
Wow. Wait, so from 32,000 to over 1 million.
Yes. It represents a nominal growth of approximately 209% over 70 years.
Over 200%. That is, I mean, that's a booming engine.
It's a massive macroeconomic leap in total volume. Jamaica successfully executed the growth phase. The country is absolutely producing more wealth.
Okay, but and here's the pushback. If the national pie got over 200% bigger, I have questions. Like, if I'm at a dinner party and the host brings out a cake that is literally 3 times the size of the one they brought out last year.
You expect a much bigger slice.
Obviously, want a bigger slice. So where did the cake go? The distribution across different classes is just wildly uneven.
It is. But before we point fingers at who ate the cake, we actually have to look at how many people suddenly showed up to the party.
Ah, right. The guest list.
Exactly. The demographic data changes the math significantly.
Yeah, let me pull up the population pillar charts from the sources here, because this is fascinating. If we look back in 1926, the total population was roughly 949,000.
So under 1 million people.
Right. And then by 1950, when our NDP data starts tracking this big boom, it was around 1.4 million.
Okay, so growing, but manageable.
But then look at the 2024 estimate. It balloons to roughly 2.3 million people.
And what's fascinating here is when you compare the slope of that population growth curve directly against the NDP growth curve.
They're racing against each other.
They really are. The rapid growth in population fundamentally diluted the dividends brought by that macroeconomic growth.
Because you're dividing the wealth by way more people.
Exactly. There is immense structural pressure on raising the per capita NDP when the denominator, the people, is growing so incredibly fast.
So it turns this macro success story on paper into a like a micro struggle for the individual. Like you, the listener, might live in an economy that the headlines say is booming.
But your personal share feels like it's shrinking.
Right. Because it's being spread so incredibly thin across a million more people.
Exactly. It's the friction of demography. But we have to be careful because population growth alone does not explain extreme poverty.
No, it doesn't.
It thins things out, sure. But to understand the real disparity, we have to measure the inequality itself. We have to look at how the capital is actually moving.
Which brings us to the cold reality of the Giannini coefficient.
Yes, the Giannini coefficient. Based on pre-tax national income, this is the gold standard for measuring inequality.
And the scale goes from 0 to 1, right? Where 0 is perfect equality and 1 is like one guy owns everything.
Correct. And for the entire population in 2021, Jamaica's Giannini coefficient stood at roughly 0.49.
0.49.
It's exceptionally high. To give that context, the global warning line for severe systemic inequality is 0.4.
And they are at 0.49. They're blowing right past the warning line.
They are, and it's not a blip. Jamaica has been oscillating at these extremely high levels well above the warning line for a very long time. It is a textbook, real-world example of the Matthew effect.
The Matthew effect. That's the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
Exactly. The systemic advantages compound over time.
Well, let's look at the poor getting poorer part, because I'm looking at this pie chart for the bottom 50% in 2023. And this is where it gets really interesting, or, well, really depressing.
The numbers are stark.
Half of the entire population, 50% of the people you see walking down the street, they hold a disposable income share, what the data calls DICSIC, of just 0.0495.
Less than 5% of the total income pie.
How does that even work? Half the country is sharing less than 5%. Their per capita disposable income is a mere $131,222.3, which is vastly below the national average.
It's barely survival levels.
I mean, really, how do people even survive when the math is that brutal?
To answer how they survive, we have to look at what they actually earn from their labor. Because for the bottom 50%, labor is their only leverage.
Right, they trade their time for a paycheck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if we look at the treadmill effect of stagnant wages, you start to see the illusion of motion in this economy.
I have the bar chart here comparing national wages to private average wages. And in the 1980s, the average adult national wage was $5,040,527.
A pretty solid baseline for the era.
But cut to 2024. The average adult national wage is recorded at $2,564,320.
It essentially halved.
It halved. And we're talking about real purchasing power here. That's why I call it the treadmill effect. Imagine you are on a treadmill, right?
Okay, I'm running.
You are running at a full sprint. You are sweating. You are putting in 50 hours a week, working harder than you ever have in your life. But the economy, inflation, keeps cranking up the speed of the belt beneath your feet.
And you can't keep up.
Decades pass, and you look down and you realize you haven't just stayed in place. You've actually slid backward. You are further from your goals than when you started.
That is exactly what a severe drop in purchasing power and shrinking nominal wages looks like from the high points of the 1980s.
It's exhausting just to think about.
For the working class, these wage fluctuations over the decades, they aren't just spreadsheet numbers. They represent a relative impoverishment driven by intense cost of living pressures. The labor share of the total wealth is actively shrinking.
Okay, but wait. The NDP grew by 209%. The economy produced the wealth. If labor isn't getting paid, if the workers aren't seeing it, where's all the money actually going?
It's going to the very top. And it's getting locked inside assets.
The wealth pyramid.
Yes. Let's look at the top 1%.
I'm pulling up this inverted triangle infographic from the data. In 2021, the average household wealth of the top 1% was a staggering $6,016,359.5.
Which is hundreds of times the wealth of the bottom tier.
Hundreds of times. And here's the wild part. It's not just cash sitting in a bank account.
No, it's materialized in assets.
Right.
And there is one asset class that acts as the anchor of this inequality.
Housing.
Yes. Look at the stacked bar chart of government versus private housing assets for 2022. It reveals the structural root of the whole system.
Let me read this because my jaw dropped when I saw this scale. The median private housing asset sits massively at over $5.3 trillion.
And let's say the full number just to give it weight.
Okay, it's $5,310,209,589,248.
That is the macro accounting of private real estate wealth.
And compare that to the government side. The average government housing asset is a paltry $134,450.1.
The disparity is almost difficult to conceptualize, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, real estate is the core of Jamaican household wealth.
Obviously, with numbers like that.
Right. And the immense scale of privately held housing means that those without property are permanently left behind in wealth accumulation.
Because housing isn't just shelter anymore.
Exactly. It is an impenetrable fortress of wealth preservation for the top.
So if I'm drawing an arrow from that top 1% wealth directly to the NDP growth, it's like the national growth is just magnetically pulled up to the peak of the pyramid.
It absolutely is.
And it completely locks out the renters. The people at the bottom are paying rent to the people at the top, funding their asset growth, while their own wages shrink.
It's a closed loop of wealth generation for the asset class.
So without assets to rely on, and with wages shrinking on that treadmill, what does the middle and bottom class do? How do they buy groceries?
They borrow.
Debt.
They are overdrafting their futures. Let's look at the leverage and debt data.
I've got the scale infographic here. It balances assets versus liabilities. In 2021, the average adult national total debt reached $2,646,059.5.
And the sources note that private debt weight remains highly significant even post-2021.
So they're just carrying this massive burden.
They have to. The middle and lower classes are surviving by overdrafting their futures. They rely on consumer debt to maintain basic living standards.
Buying food on credit card.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the top tier utilizes debt differently. They use it against their asset appreciation to grow even more wealth.
Right, borrowing against their $5.3 trillion in real estate to buy more real estate.
And this fundamentally tears the wealth structure further apart. The poor pay interest to survive, the rich collect interest to grow.
And this isn't just a local problem, is it? Because Jamaica doesn't exist in a vacuum. Let's look at the living standard gap globally.
Right, the purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Yeah, comparing Jamaica to the rest of the world. Looking at historical data from the 1960s, Jamaica's living standard index based on US PPP was 0.40.
Okay.
But the EU PPP index was 0.641.
That's a significant gap.
So despite 70 years of NDP growth, we are perpetually playing a game of international catch-up, right? Getting battered by exchange rate fluctuations. Are we just running a race where the finish line keeps moving?
That's exactly what's happening, because the internal wealth is locked in static assets rather than productive, globally competitive industries. The currency struggles.
So the people at the bottom are hit by local inflation and global exchange rates at the same time.
It's a double squeeze. Naturally, you'd think the government would step in to fix this imbalance.
Yeah, where is the state in all this?
And they do try. The data shows they are highly active. But their approach is fundamentally flawed.
Okay, let's look at government finance, because this blew my mind.
It's a drop in the bucket, structurally speaking, even though the numbers are large.
I have a bar chart showing education and Social Security spending. In 2024, the education expenditure weight is 0.0634.
Which is decent.
But the Social Security expenditure weight is nearly 0.2. It's specifically 0.196. And if I circle the growth in Social Security, it almost doubled from 0.101 back in 1970.
So the state is pouring massive resources into welfare.
20% of their weight.
This brings us back to the paradox from the intro. The government is trying. They are actively using transfer payments to alleviate poverty.
But it's not working. The Gini coefficient is still 0.49.
Exactly. Because it's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. It addresses survival, but it doesn't touch the root structure of distribution.
It's like bailing water out of a sinking boat with a teacup. You know?
That's a good analogy.
You are working so hard, you're sweating, you're spending all this energy dipping the cup and throwing water overboard, but you aren't plugging the hole in the hull.
And the hole in the hull is the structural asset inequality.
Right. If the government gives a family a welfare check, and that family immediately hands it to their landlord to pay rent,
money flows straight back into the $5.3 trillion real estate fortress.
The government is basically subsidizing the asset holders.
Unintentionally, yes. That is the mechanical outcome. The capital doesn't build equity for the poor, it just passes through them.
That is just, wow. And it's not just affecting bank accounts. This inequality affects the actual air you breathe.
This is Section 8, environmental injustice.
Because we have to talk about carbon. There is a scatter plot here mapping income levels against per capita carbon footprints.
And the correlation is massive.
It really is. The data shows this massive positive correlation. The per capita CO2 footprint of the labor force rises significantly as wealth increases.
This raises an important question about how we view emissions. The top tier's weight in carbon emissions heavily outpaces the bottom.
Because they're flying, they have huge houses to cool, they consume way more.
Exactly. Wealth inequality is inherently tied to environmental justice. The rich consume and emit. while the poor often bear the ecological consequences.
Living in areas prone to flooding, dealing with the pollution, and lacking the capital to escape it.
Right. And while the top tier is emitting all this carbon, we also have to look at what the corporations are doing with their capital, because there's a massive disconnect there, too.
The corporate savings data.
Yes. Looking at the stacked area chart, the 2022 average consumption of fixed capital is 9,740.1.
Okay, but what does that mean for the average person?
Well, the key is that corporate savings weights have fluctuated wildly since the 2000s.
Right, they aren't stable. Corporate savings have completely decoupled from national welfare growth.
Exactly. In a healthy economy, corporations save and reinvest in total factor productivity. Better machines, better tech, better training for workers.
Which would raise wages and get people off the treadmill.
But that's not happening. The capital accumulation is flowing into the pockets of the asset holders as dividends or buybacks, rather than being reinvested into improving productivity for the nation.
The wealth is just pooling at the top. So what does this all mean when we put the pieces together? Because we've covered a lot of heavy data.
Let's do the ultimate diagnosis, the poverty-fied growth trap.
Okay, I want to actively map out this logic chain for the listener so we can see the whole machine working. It's a 5-step flow.
Go ahead.
Step 1, the total NDP grows. The economy works, wealth is generated.
Right, 209% growth.
Step 2, that wealth is immediately and highly concentrated in private housing and financial assets, the fortress.
Exactly.
Step 3, because it pools in assets, the percentage of wealth going to labor and wages shrinks. The treadmill effect.
Wages have in purchasing power.
Step 4, the government steps in with high Social Security spending, like 20% weight, but it's only enough to keep people alive, not to lift them up.
It pays the rent, but builds no equity.
And finally, step 5, the cycle of inequality repeats and hardens.
That is a perfect summary of the data's narrative.
Yeah.
Jamaica is not facing a problem of no growth.
No, the growth is definitely there.
It is facing a crisis of locked growth.
Locked growth. I like that term. Well, I hate the reality of it, but it perfectly describes the data.
The wealth exists, but it circulates exclusively at the top tier. Social mobility is completely paralyzed by asset barriers.
So how do we reweigh the scales? Because we can't just leave everyone depressed. The source material actually has strategic recommendations, right?
It does. It lays out 3 data-driven policy icons. And again, noting our disclaimer, these are objective analytical proposals from the text, not our political endorsements.
Right, we're just reading the manual on how to fix the engine.
Exactly. The first is tax reform.
Okay, how does that work?
The data suggests implementing more effective progressive taxes on high-value private housing and assets. You have to tap into the $5.3 trillion fortress to recirculate that capital into the productive economy.
Makes sense. Stop taxing the guys on the treadmill so much. Start taxing the static wealth. What's the second one?
Skill dividends. Translating the already high education expenditures at 0.0634 weight into actual wage growth.
So creating high-value added jobs, not just educating people so they can go work low-wage jobs and be in debt.
Exactly. You need industries that can absorb the educated workforce.
Yeah.
And the third recommendation is inclusive finance.
Oh, this is huge.
Lowering the heavy debt weight on individuals, getting them out from under that 2.6 million average debt, and increasing the rate of financial asset holdings for the bottom tier.
You have to let them own a piece of the fortress. They can't just be renters forever.
Precisely.
So synthesizing this whole journey, we went from the illusion of this amazing 209% macro growth all the way down to the harsh reality of the treadmill effect and debt survival.
It's a complex picture, and I want to leave the listener with a final lingering idea to mull over.
Please do.
If the true wealth of a nation is locked in concrete, literally in the private housing and real estate of the top 1%, what happens to the innovative potential of the next generation?
Wow. Yeah.
When the brightest minds in your country are forced to take on massive debt just to survive, how much future genius is being actively stifled by the present wealth structure?
How many entrepreneurs or inventors are just stuck working double shifts to pay their landlord?
Exactly. It's a massive loss of human capital.
It really is. It hoards potential, not just money. And I think there is a powerful, memorable closing line drawn right from the sources that sums this up perfectly. True sunshine shouldn't just light up the beaches. It should shine in the pockets of every Jamaican.
A perfect way to end it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.